The iPhone XS is dead. With the launch of iOS 26, the iPhone XS and XS Max are no longer receiving the latest major software updates. But considering the phones are already 7 years old and do hold up better than you might expect, there certainly are worse fates. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91Tech, and the iPhone XS and XS Max might just be one of the most forgettable generations in iPhone history, at least had they not released alongside the iPhone XR all the way back in 2018. That phone was a whole lot more exciting and colorful, and it's also stuck forever on iOS 18, but it was the mid-range model and didn't represent the best of what Apple had to offer. That crown would go to the iPhone XS, the headlining features of which including that new larger max size option, as well as, let me see here, there was a new gold color, so that was pretty nice, and that's basically it. I joke around a bit, but the XS probably was in fact the most boring iPhone upgrade of all time. It's definitely up there, and we'll be discussing exactly why that is, as well as what makes this absolutely gorgeous piece of hardware tick. Today we're talking about the life, death, and legacy of the iPhone XS and XS Max.
So, iPhone XS, iPhone XS Max, they are stunning. The best iPhones we've ever made by a long shot.
Naturally, this is not the first time I've made a video with this title. As explained in my recent video on the XR, iPhones really have multiple deaths over time, the first being when Apple stopped selling them. That would be the subject of this video I made all the way back in 2019 as the XS and XS Max were discontinued with the release of the 11 Pro. The second death for an iPhone is the one we're discussing today, as Apple is no longer granting the XS major software updates moving forward. But this is only the second death, and losing out on iOS 26 doesn't render the device necessarily obsolete. We've still got years left of security updates and app compatibility, and even once that dries up, there can still be some level of functionality for these phones, even if it's about the opposites of an ideal scenario. Mind you, using the XS as it is right now is also very much not ideal, even if it was still up to date as of a month ago, and it's hard to imagine too many people are using the XS anymore, and that has nothing to do with it being stuck on iOS 18. This is a 7-year-old phone, and the battery life wasn't particularly great when it came out in 2018. Not hard to make the assumption it's going to be pretty awful now. Even with a battery that's still relatively healthy, I can't imagine the XS is getting you too many hours of screen on time past maybe the lightest of usage. And you might expect the XS Max to be at least better here thanks to the physically larger size, and it is, but it's also pretty awful, with the iPhone XR having both phones beat by Apple's own benchmarks. Again, even in 2018, the XS really wasn't impressive for battery life, and I would know because I myself bought the XS day one at launch, coming off the iPhone X. Silver, 64 gigs, I didn't get the Max or even the new color because I just loved my iPhone X so much, I didn't want anything to feel like it changed, and sure enough, yeah, nothing really felt like it changed, and that kind of turned out to be not such a good thing. I do remember ultimately being disappointed in my XS, but it was still a really solid phone, and outside of mid-battery performance, I never had too many complaints. The phone I have here is actually the XS Max. I don't own a smaller iPhone XS anymore. This smaller device is an iPhone X, but it does look practically identical to the XS. The only obvious difference from the exterior is the antenna bands. There's an extra band near the lightning port on the XS, but not the X. And what makes this phone so uninteresting but also rather unique within Apple's iPhone history is just how little changed from its predecessor. I might joke and say the only new features were the max size and gold color, but ostensibly it's kinda true. Everything else that was new were just standard incremental improvements we see year to year. This is Apple's final S model phone, and that S may have made the lack of upgrade feel okay. I mean, Apple has done it before, starting all the way back in 2009 with the iPhone 3GS. It had the same body as the 08 iPhone 3G and really only improved on the speeds and photography. However, this was the very early days of smartphones, and the jump from the 3G to the 3GS was actually kind of massive. We're talking about double the speeds, hence the S in 3GS, and the camera actually became somewhat usable. The jump from the 10 to the XS is far more minimal. This wasn't just the final S model iPhone, it was also the worst. And Apple, of course, did move on from it to now using the Pro moniker that we've been seeing since the 11 Pro. Apple's overall nomenclature was probably at its worst in 2018. People were already calling the iPhone X the iPhone X. The X was supposed to be Roman numerals, celebrating the 10-year anniversary of iPhone. And sure, okay, for that phone, fair enough. It was very different for iPhone, it might as well use Roman numerals, that's fun. But the iPhone XS and XR, the XS and XR, XR? Look, XR is bad enough, but when your latest and most expensive iPhone is already going to be criticized for changing so little from the previous model and is seen as gratuitously overpriced, maybe calling that phone something that sounds like the word excess isn't such a great idea. The word excess does feel like an appropriate descriptor of this phone, but it's important to emphasize that I don't think this phone is bad, despite how negative on it I might sound. I actually think it's a great phone, but mostly because the iPhone X was an amazing phone. This is still to this day one of the most beautiful designs Apple has ever made, and this might be also my favorite version of the gold color of any iPhone they've done. The XS Max is just gorgeous, straight up. It feels like a work of art. While I do love that orange iPhone 17 Pro, it doesn't feel as luxurious or classy. It feels more practical maybe, more industrial, at least to me. And while that's fine, I wouldn't call this phone beautiful. And it is nice to go back to a phone that feels like such an absolute iconic piece of Apple design. But let's start off with the lead up to the iPhone XS to make sure we get the full picture of everything it brought to the table and why it felt as seemingly boring as I might remember. And our story really begins with the unveiling of the iPhone X.
This is iPhone X. It is the biggest leap forward since the original iPhone.
So it's 2017, and smartphones are about to enter a new era of immersive, small bezeled displays. You had the Galaxy S8 come out earlier in the year with its fancy Infinity display that quite frankly blew away everything Apple had ever offered. Compared to the LCD panel of the iPhone 7 and 7 Plus, the Galaxy S8 was visibly sharper thanks to the high resolution, and far more vibrant with true blacks, as individual pixels could be turned off, whereas on an LCD, even showing a black screen requires the backlight to still be turned on completely, hence why black used to always look blue. Apple needed to be able to compete with Samsung, but it was an objective fact that Samsung had the best displays, which funnily enough led Apple to working with them on what would become the Super Retina display on the iPhone X. But before that, Apple would first announce the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus, the more standard follow-up to the 7 and 7 Plus. It had the same design but with a glass backing for wireless charging, and they were solid phones, but more of the same we'd been seeing since the iPhone 6. But then there was one more thing, the gorgeous, mind-blowing iPhone X that extended the display to cover nearly the entire front of the device. The home button was gone in favor of gesture navigation, and the only compromise was the large notch at the top to host things like the selfie camera and Face ID sensors. And the iPhone X was also very expensive at $999, being one of the first phones to cost so much, though I think it's fair to say this might be one of the only $1,000 phones that's ever truly been able to justify its price point, at least in my opinion. It was a really big jump from previous iPhones. Not only was this screen edge to edge, but it was also the first OLED panel on iPhone, Super Retina, as Apple called it, and man was it ever beautiful. It still is, but it was on the small side, even compared to something like the 5.5-inch iPhone 8 Plus. Sure, the 5.8-inch iPhone X was technically larger if you measured diagonally, but the 8 Plus was wider, which meant most content actually appeared larger on that phone. The iPhone X was kind of like if you took an iPhone 8 and just removed the top and bottom bezels. We did need a bigger size option, but it was absent here, likely due to how rushed this phone was. While it was announced in September and the iPhone 8 released that same month, the iPhone X didn't launch until November, one of the few times Apple's had to delay an iPhone over the years. Everything about this phone felt rushed, with Apple even showing off their ridiculously over-engineered wireless charging mat and AirPower that would never end up actually releasing due to its slight propensity for catching fire. Yes, this is a real AirPower prototype, by the way, that I did actually have at one point, and it did work, so cool stuff. When the iPhone X did finally come out, it would be in only 2 color options. The first time since the iPhone 5, Apple only had 2 colors, and supply would be extremely limited. I remember pre-ordering only minutes after midnight, and I still had to wait an extra week before my iPhone X arrived. And man was I ever excited for that phone, and man was that phone ever buggy on iOS 11, it was brutal. The new gesture navigation meant iOS had to change pretty massively, and this no doubt took much of the focus away from less pressing issues, like, the software actually being functional. We need our emojis, and we need them now. I don't care how many times your phone might crash.
And, let's try that again. Ho, ho, ho. Let's go to backup here.
Okay, it's not like Apple intentionally made iOS 11 suck, but it adds to my theory that Apple actually rushed the iPhone X by a year. I suspect that the XS and XS Max are what the iPhone X was supposed to be in 2018, and the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus were potentially going to be the only phones Apple would have launched in 2017. Then the XR could have been the iPhone 9 or something. It doesn't really matter since the iPhone X did launch in 2017, that's what happened. And because it came out at that time, it was easily one of the most innovative smartphones ever made. The phone changed everything about how smartphones would be made in the future. It was really the ultimate iPhone at the time. It wasn't perfect, but it was such a jump from previous iPhones that, at least to me, it felt perfect. But only 10 months later, it would be discontinued by Apple as they announced their newest iPhones.
We're going to take iPhone 10 to the next level. I'm excited to show you what is by far the most advanced iPhone we have ever created.
Now we come to fall 2018 and Apple is revealing the all-new iPhone XS and XS Max. Finally, we see a larger size with that edge-to-edge design, and it was pretty big, 6.5 inches. Max felt like a pretty appropriate name, and this was the first time Apple had ever used it after years of having Plus iPhones. The iPhone XR would be announced after the XS, and it was Apple's new mid-range model that sort of took the place of the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus, though those phones would stick around for the time being at a reduced price if you preferred to keep the home button. It says a lot to me that Apple announced the iPhone XS and XS Max first, before the XR. As far as I'm aware, this is the only time Apple hasn't revealed their best flagship last. The iPhone 5C in 2013 came before the 5S, the iPhone Air in 2025 was shown before the 17 Pro. I suspect because Apple knew the XS was such a lackluster upgrade, they wanted to get it out of the way and finish off with something that would get people talking. And I myself at the time remember feeling like the XR was the far more exciting model, and the XS and XS Max were kind of just there. It's worth noting, as a really odd outlier in Apple's release history with these phones, their events, whether live or pre-recorded now, tend to follow very similar patterns in how everything is presented, but not with this phone. I'm not saying Apple wasn't confident in their best flagship necessarily, but I'm also not saying they were either. One thing I'll give Apple credit for with the iPhone XS is how they were seemingly fixing some of what was lacking the prior year. We got a third color option, we got a bigger size option, and iOS 12 was an update geared toward improving stability and performance. That was so needed, and I do remember the XS and iOS 12 feeling far more stable than my iPhone 10 on iOS 11. I mentioned the iPhone 10 feeling rushed, and if I'm right about that, it would explain why so little changed in the iPhone XS. After all, they've made all the big upgrades they had available at their disposal the previous year, and they still have to think about 2019 too. It was also a bit of a unique situation in that the iPhone X is, to my knowledge, the shortest-lived iPhone in Apple's lineup ever. It was only sold from November 2017 to September 2018, 10 months, and for at least the first half of that period of time, the supply simply couldn't keep up with the demand. All this makes for less time for Apple to figure things out for the next generation. And so we got this sort of compromised model in the iPhone XS and XS Max, a slightly refined and improved iPhone X, now bigger than ever. This was the final iPhone with 3D Touch, it even being absent from the iPhone XR. While this was a cool feature back in the day, Apple would essentially phase out all of its unique functionality with iOS updates. What I missed the most from 3D Touch is being able to force touch anywhere on the keyboard in order to control the cursor versus having to hold onto the spacebar, and there's a longer delay because of it. And that was a nice thing about 3D Touch too, because it was pressure sensitive, there was no delay, no hesitation like there is with haptic touch, which is just long pressing. It was really great tech, but ultimately pretty unnecessary, and it did take up space internally that could be better utilized by an increased battery capacity. As I've hinted at, the XS and XS Max were pretty mediocre in this department, but Apple's tech was still evolving even if it wasn't leading yet to better results. The iPhone XS had a new single-cell L-shaped battery, then had a slightly smaller capacity than the iPhone Xs, and was said to only get 30 more minutes of life. The XS Max, on the other hand, stuck with the two-cell approach and only had 90 more minutes than the iPhone X, which was disappointing considering how much bigger that phone was. Thankfully, both the XS and XS Max are absolutely gorgeous pieces of hardware. I mean, just look at this thing. The design is beautiful. The glossy glass backing, the polished stainless steel frame. I loved the iPhone X design so much for going back to kind of what we had with the iPhone 4, and the XS just carried that forward. These curved sides are so comfortable in the hand and feel very much out of place compared to the flat-sided phones of today. Everything's glossy, no matte finishes, so the phone can be a fingerprint magnet, but I never really minded. Then there's that vertically oriented camera bump featuring a 12 megapixel wide and 12 megapixel telephoto lens, allowing for not only 2x optical zoom, but cool features like portrait mode photos. Portrait mode photos were available on the iPhone XR as well, with just its wide lens, but it only used software processing, so theoretically results should have been more consistent on the XS. We also had this new depth control feature, which was kinda cool, where you could increase or decrease the bokeh. Neat feature, one I probably haven't touched more than a handful of times since I purchased the XS all those years ago, but hey, still pretty cool.
Actually, one annoyance is that the camera on the back seems to be sized slightly differently, which is a pain because my red leather case that I had on my iPhone X doesn't seem to fit perfectly.
Overall, these cameras were a minor improvement from the iPhone X and nothing mind-blowing, but an improvement all the same. And while this was a top-of-the-line setup for 2018, the Pixel 3 was definitely the king of still photography around this time, even with only one lens. Apple did have everyone beat in video though, and the XS, XS Max, and iPhone XR were the first iPhones able to record stereo audio. All the computational photography was only continuing to improve in tandem with Apple's silicon. We saw the A12 Bionic chipset here as well as 4 GB of RAM, up from the A11 and 3 GB of RAM in the iPhone X. The XR would get similar specs, only 3 GB of RAM, but the A12 chip. That A12 chip is no joke, and there's a reason these phones got so many updates for so many years. The iPhone XS would also get IP68 water and dust resistance, up from IP67, so the phone was more likely to survive a drop in the sink or toilet. This was also the first iPhone with dual SIM card support, as it could use a physical nano SIM card and an eSIM card at the same time. Fun fact though, the iPhone XS Max in China didn't have eSIM at all, but instead a tray that actually had room for 2 physical SIM cards. While there may be some more minor things coming off the iPhone X, like Face ID getting faster, the highlights really did boil down to the max size option and the gold color. The A12 chip and slightly improved cameras were the only other features of note that had this phone feeling any different whatsoever from its predecessor. Not hard to see why Apple chose this phone to show before the iPhone XR. So the iPhone XS and XS Max, small upgrades sure, but seemingly great phones nonetheless, right? Well, yeah, and the reviews were in fact generally quite positive. The sense of apathy I felt towards this phone at the time wasn't unique to me, but the reality of course was that most people didn't get the iPhone X. And if they did, they weren't going to be upgrading to the iPhone XS because why would they? It's the problem with buying the new iPhone every year. Some years just aren't going to feel a whole lot different, though this was more so true with the XS than we might be accustomed to. The XS wasn't completely without its controversy. Outside of a minor charging issue that was fixed early on, Beautygate would get the most buzz. It was purported that selfies had an unrealistic smoothing effect on the skin, much like the beauty modes on a lot of Android phones. Except, this couldn't be turned off. It seemed to be related to Apple's new Smart HDR camera feature. Smart HDR takes multiple photos at once at different exposures and merges them all together to increase the dynamic range, and it wasn't choosing the right frame. The result was that blurring beauty effect, and Apple would fix it with iOS 12.1 right at the end of October 2018. The iPhone XS also didn't have any sort of night photography, which was heavily criticized as a new and upcoming feature in a lot of competitors, like the Pixel 3. All in all though, the iPhone XS and XS Max were still basically the ultimate package for iPhone users in 2018. Yeah, the iPhone XR was probably better value, but if you wanted that gorgeous display, you just had to go with the XS. It looks so good, with not only those deep, vibrant colors of the OLED versus the LCD, but also these far thinner bezels. The XR was 6.1 inches and cost $750, so with it, you actually did get a larger phone than the $1,000 5.8-inch XS, and you had all the same specs, just one less camera and the lower quality display. Bigger phone, less money, and nearly just as good. Well, I mean, there is a reason the XR sold as well as it did. But there is something to be said about a phone this compact and so easy to use with one hand. And of course, if that wasn't for you, it was really nice to have a bigger option with the 6.5-inch XS Max at $1,100. The XS still came with only 64 GB at the entry level, but that was pretty standard for the time. 64 gigs would also be in the next flagships, the announcement of which would mark the discontinuation of the iPhone XS and XS Max on September 10th, 2019. Hence that video I made all those years ago.
I think the XS will unfortunately be forgotten in the history of Apple. The iPhone X was innovative and a huge leap forward for the smartphone market in general, and then the iPhone XS kinda just wasn't.
2019 would be the year Apple finally fixed their naming scheme moving forward, with the iPhone 11, 11 Pro, and 11 Pro Max releasing. After the disappointing lack of change in the XS, the 11 Pro was a breath of fresh air, with a refreshed design and some actual upgrades of substance, particularly in photography. The frosted glass finish, triple camera lens setup, and substantially better battery life. Getting that beautiful green iPhone 11 Pro Max felt like such a huge upgrade for me at the time, and it really was. Still, looking back, I can't help but feel like, if anything, the design of the iPhone X and XS was truly something special. That vertical camera bump with the darkened glass, the stainless steel ring around it, it was only used on these two generations of phone, whereas the triple lens setup from the 11 Pro has more or less stuck around until now, until even today. The iPhone XS and XS Max may have only been sold for a year and are easily forgettable in the grand scheme of things, but that doesn't make them any less of a work of art, at least in my eyes. This phone is beautiful, plain and simple. And so now we come to today, with the iPhone XS and XS Max being stuck on iOS 18 forever alongside the iPhone XR. And while the software might have the older UI, at least we've still got some tinted icons, and I'll be honest, they do look fantastic on that Super Retina OLED display. Aside from only running 60Hz, the screen has held up amazingly well. It is stunning. This isn't a fast phone, and I've had it feel outright slow on me when a lot was going on, but it's been mostly fine and can ultimately still download basically any app and do nearly anything that I would be able to do on my brand new 17 Pro. It'll just be slower and perhaps less reliable. It is kind of wild to see just how far we've come in battery life over the years. Apple claims the smaller 17 Pro can get up to 33 hours of video playback, compared to 15 hours on the iPhone XS Max. I would believe that it's at least doubly as good as my iPhone XS was back when I got it in late 2018. I remember that being the biggest complaint with that phone, as well as it maybe being a little bit on the small side, which is of course why I got the 11 Pro Max the next year. Of all the iPhones I've owned, and there's been a lot of them, I do think the XS is probably the most forgettable. It's not helped that I got basically the exact same phone as my iPhone X, but even so, usually there's at least one little thing that helps me remember a phone in hindsight. The XS just didn't really have that. But just because the XS was unexciting doesn't make it any less of an ultimately solid smartphone. And what's really crazy is I could have still been using that exact same XS that I bought so many years ago had I not sold it on Craigslist fall 2019, and if that was the case, I would have still had full software support until now. Sure, a couple battery replacements might have been in there, and even then I'd probably be plugging the phone multiple times throughout the day, but it would have been usable, assuming I didn't let the storage get too full and maybe did the odd reset to keep the performance a bit more fresh. Yeah, the XS would have gotten the job done for the past 7 years, fully supported. And heck, it could still work if you need it in a pinch or as a backup phone. That A12 chipset is a beast, and both the iPhone XS and the XR did get an extra 2 years of updates over the iPhone 8 and 10, which are stuck all the way back on iOS 16.
I guess what I'm saying is that although the XS is pretty unexciting and is perhaps the smallest iPhone upgrade ever, it also holds its own and is a perfectly great smartphone right now, at least if you can stomach the price tag. I think the insignificance of this phone is just a testament to how ahead of things the iPhone X was. It really was a great phone, and I think it's actually going to be looked back at as the beginning of the modern era of smartphones, with no home buttons and eventually all screen displays. But that's just what I think, and I'm some random dude on the internet.
I think it says a lot that one of the smallest iPhone upgrades of all time still made it for a phone that held up far better than its contemporaries. Something like the 2018 Pixel 3 XL that I looked at in a review a while back definitely beats the XS in photography, but its last major software update, 2021. The XS got 4 extra years of updates, and something like the Galaxy S9 was even worse, getting to only 2020. The iPhone XS may not have much legacy to speak of, but it has had a long life, and I do think it's worth remembering, if only for that absolutely gorgeous design. Just beautiful. I mean, look at it. Maybe it's just a case of always wanting something you can't have, but the more I look at this, I don't know, maybe I just missed that design just a little bit. And I'm so glad I had an excuse to talk about the XS and XS Max today. Did any of you also own it back in the day? Is anyone still using it? Make sure you let me know what you think about the phone in the comments below. Is it the smallest iPhone upgrade of all time? I think there's one that is smaller for sure, and that's the iPhone 14 from the 13, but that also wasn't like Apple's Pro phone, so it's not quite the same thing. The 15 Pro to the 16 Pro was also a really small upgrade. I might actually give the XS the edge over that phone. It's a tough call. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this. Linked in the description will be the video on the death of the iPhone XR if you want to see that too, as well as the death of the iPhone 15 as Apple has just stopped selling it with the new iPhones releasing. Big shout out to the channel members. Thank you guys so much for your support. And thank you all for watching. I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.